At 19, with everything he owned in a duffel bag and a dead man's tools, Eli Hawthorne walked out of a county office in upstate New York into a town that had no use for him. So, when the courthouse annex listed the boarded-up Victorian at the top of Ferry Hill, empty 11 years, the one nobody in 3 generations had been willing to walk past after dark, he raised his hand and bought it for $20. The crowd in the room laughed. They called it a money pit, a fire hazard, a haunted shell, and told him he'd thrown away the little he had left. But he'd been taught by a man who fixed engines that nothing was finished just because it had stopped. So he climbed the hill. And on his second night, when a stray hound dog wouldn't stop scratching at one stretch of dining room wall, he peeled back the wallpaper and found a door someone had sealed shut on purpose. And behind it, a room the whole town had spent half a century pretending was something other than what it was. That was later. First, there was the discharge office and the trash bags and a caseworker who couldn't quite meet his eyes. She had a folder open on the desk and a wall clock that was 4 minutes slow. Eli had checked it against the wristwatch Otis Burdick had given him when he was 14, a Timex that still ran on the same battery it had come with. Small habits like that kept his hands busy. "You're all set," the woman said. "Your file, your birth certificate, your state ID, your social security card." There's a list of shelters in the folder, too. The one in Coxsackie takes men under 25, but you've got to call by 3 to hold a bed. "I know about Coxsackie," Eli said. "You turned 19 on Sunday, so..." She made the same small shrug he had seen a dozen caseworkers make in 7 years. The shrug that finished sentences nobody wanted to finish. The state's done what it can. Eli looked at the 2 black trash bags slumped against the wall by his chair. One held clothes in a sleeping bag and a paperback copy of John Steinbeck's Travels, with Charlie he had read 4 times. The other held a heavy canvas tool roll he had carried through 5 placements and never once let out of his sight. "That all you've got?" the woman asked, watching him gather them. "That's all." There were no tears, because he had cried himself out of those years before, and crying had never once moved a single signature on a single page. He had learned that crying was a thing you spent and got nothing back for. So he signed where the pen pointed, took the folder, and walked out into a cold October morning with $68 folded in his sock and no idea where he would sleep when the cold came down. He was good at one thing, and it was the reason he had kept the tool roll. When he was 13, the state had placed him with a man named Otis Burdick, who lived on a failed dairy farm outside a small Greene County town, and who had not had a foster placement in 20 years before Eli's file landed on his table. Otis was 68 years old, lean and slow-moving, with a face the color and texture of saddle leather and a left hand that was missing the tip of the ring finger from an accident with a bench grinder in 1971. He did not say more than 50 words in the first week. Eli had not minded. Eli had spent his first 13 years in places where the wrong words came easy and the right words never came at all, and silence was a relief. Then one Saturday morning, Otis walked him out to the barn behind the house. The barn was the size of a small church and had been a working dairy in the 70s and was now a workshop, packed end to end with the carcasses of old engines and the half-dismantled bodies of 3 pickup trucks and a 1948 Ford 8N tractor that Otis had been working on, off and on, for 19 years. Otis stopped at a workbench and pointed to a small gasoline engine sitting on a square of plywood. The engine was rust orange, mostly seized, with a starter cord that had rotted away to nothing. A Briggs & Stratton 4 horsepower from a push mower somebody had abandoned in the field behind the barn the year Nixon resigned. "This here," Otis said, "is a dead motor. Folks would tell you to scrap it." He paused. "You know what's wrong with it?" "Everything," Eli said. Otis almost smiled. Otis rarely did the full thing. Nothing's wrong with it that hands can't fix. He handed Eli a wire brush. A motor isn't dead because it stopped. It's dead when nobody's willing to listen to what's wrong. For 2 years, Eli listened. He learned to read an engine by sound first and feel second, the way Otis had been taught by his own father in the 1950s. He learned to pull a head and lap a valve and rebuild a carburetor with parts you cleaned in a coffee can full of kerosene. He learned that an engine is never one problem. It's always 3 problems pretending to be one. He learned that patience was a tool, same as a wrench. Otis gave him the wire brush, then a set of feeler gauges, then a torque wrench Otis's own father had bought new in 1949. And that still read true. By the end of the second summer, the barn was the first place Eli had ever walked into and felt the room get easier when he arrived instead of harder. Then, one morning, Otis didn't come out for breakfast. Eli found him on the barn floor beside the 8N tractor. The paramedic said his heart, like Otis had said the engine said when they finally quit, just the heart. A woman from the county arrived with a folder before Otis was even in the ground, and Eli was in a group home in Schenectady before the funeral was held. Nobody asked if he wanted anything from the barn. He took the canvas tool roll the night before they came, and he hid it under his shirt while they processed his transfer, and he carried it for the next 4 years through 3 more placements and 1 juvenile detention stint for something that was not his fault, but which a caseworker had not bothered to look into. The roll held what Otis had given him over 2 years, piece by piece. The set of feeler gauges, a torque wrench from 1949, a magneto puller, a spark plug socket Otis had cut down himself for tight clearances, a small leather-handled screwdriver Otis had said his own grandfather had owned, and which Eli could believe because the wooden grip had been polished by 90 years of hands and was darker on one side than the other from being held a certain way. A pair of needle-nose pliers, a set of combination wrenches, a hammer with a hickory handle Otis had replaced himself. It was heavy. Eli had carried it through everything, so he knew how to fix engines. He just had no engine to fix and nowhere to do it. The Stillwell Public Library was warm and didn't charge admission, so that was where he spent the first 3 days. He read the want ads in the Albany Times-Union and the small classifieds in the Stillwell Journal, and he learned nothing he didn't already know, which was that nobody wanted to hire a 19-year-old with no high school diploma and no address. He filled out 2 job applications anyway and listed the library as his contact because it was the only place he could reliably be reached. On the corkboard by the returns desk, between a lost cat flyer and a notice about a quilting circle that met Tuesdays, somebody had pinned a single sheet from the county clerk's office. Public auction. Tax delinquent properties. Stillwell Courthouse Annex. Thursday, 10 a.m. A list of parcel numbers ran down the page in tiny print. He wasn't sure why he went. Maybe because the annex was warm and free to sit in. Maybe because a person who owns nothing likes to be in a room where things change hands, on the chance that one of them might somehow change toward him. The annex smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee. About 25 people sat on folding chairs, most of them men, with the easy boredom of regulars. A few with notebooks, 1 or 2 in good wool coats who clearly had money and were there to make more of it. The auctioneer worked through the lots in a flat, fast voice. A burned-out triple-decker on Mill Street, a weed lot behind the lumberyard, a storefront front street that had been 3 failed restaurants in 5 years. Eli sat in the back and watched hands go up and money he would never have moved through the air like weather. "Next," the auctioneer said, and then he paused, and the pause was what made Eli look up. "Parcel 12-44, the house on Ferry Hill. Some of you know it." A few people laughed low, the sound the room had clearly made before. "Doherty Place, 3 stories plus a turret, sits on a half-acre. Condition listed as poor. Back taxes going on 11 years. Sold as is where is. County takes no responsibility is right," a man near the front said, and that got a bigger laugh. A woman a few chairs over leaned to her neighbor. "That's the Doherty house. My granddaughter won't ride her bike past it. She'd rather take the long way to school." The auctioneer let it ride a second, then cleared his throat. "We'll open at $20. He said it like he expected to take it back. $20 just to start the failure, just to get to the part where he announced no bids and moved on. Eli did the arithmetic in his head before he decided to. $20 left him 48 and change. Half an acre, 3 stories of walls and floors, and a roof that had at least kept 11 years of weather off whatever was inside. He thought about the bed and coxsackie that he'd have to call for by 3 and give up again by 7 the next morning. Every day, until something or nothing came along. He thought about Otis. A motor isn't dead because it stopped. His arm went up, slow and steady, the same way he lifted a torque wrench off a bolt at the end of a stroke so as not to slip and round a corner. For a second, nobody saw it. Then the auctioneer did, and his face did a small, complicated thing. "I've got $20 from the young man in the back." He scanned the room out of habit. "Do I hear 25? Nobody breathed to make it 25. One of the men in good wool coats turned all the way around in his chair to look at Eli. His expression wasn't pity. It was closer to annoyance, as if Eli had reached past him for the last seat on a bus. "Son," the woman with the granddaughter said, not unkindly, "you don't want that house." "20 going once," the auctioneer said. A man laughed and said, loud enough to carry, "Let him have the ghost. He can charge admission." "Going twice." Eli kept his arm where it was and his eyes on the front of the room, the way Otis used to stand when a customer questioned his repair estimate, calm and unhurried, and certain of the work in his own 2 hands. The gavel came down. Sold. The house on Ferry Hill to the young man in the back for $20. The auctioneer shook his head as he wrote it down. The room broke into the low murmuring that follows you out a door. Eli paid in 1s and a 5 at the clerk's window. The clerk was a young man with a careful tie and the kind of pressed shirt politeness of a person who had recently graduated from somewhere. He slid a single sheet of paper across the counter and then a brass key on a loop of leather, the metal dark with 11 years of nobody touching it. He held the key a half-second longer than he needed to, the way you hold something you think you might be making a mistake to hand over. "You nut place," the clerk said. It wasn't a question. "I know it's mine now," Eli said. He folded the deed into his jacket pocket beside the discharge folder and walked out before the clerk could decide to warn him about anything. Ferry Hill climbed the west side of Stillwell from the river, up through houses that got plainer and more tired the higher you went, until the pavement gave out into cracked concrete, and the trees grew up close on both sides. At the top, where the street ran out against the slope of the hill, the house stood by itself on a half-acre behind a wrought iron fence that had surrendered to rust years ago. 2 kids on bikes had trailed him the last block, hanging back, daring each other closer. When he turned up the walk, one of them braked hard. "You're not going in there," the boy said. He couldn't have been more than 10. "It's mine," Eli told him. "I bought it. I'm living here now." The 2 of them looked at each other. "Nobody lives there," the girl said, almost gently, the way you correct an adult who has gotten a simple fact wrong. There's a lady. My uncle saw her in the window when he was a kid. She used to walk around at night with a lamp. She's been dead a long time, the boy added. That's probably a stray, Eli said. Neither of them looked like they believed him. They stood on the pedals and pushed off fast down the hill, and one of them yelled something over his shoulder that the wind took before it reached him. He stopped at the broken gate and looked at the house, and for a moment he understood why the town told the stories. It was tall and narrow and unmistakably Victorian, with a round turret on the southeast corner that rose 3 stories into the gray Hudson Valley sky. The paint had gone the color of bone. Most of the windows were boarded with warped plywood, and the ones that weren't stared down at him, blank and dark. The porch sagged on one side where a post had rotted through to nothing. A wild rose, long gone feral, had climbed the whole north wall and pulled half a gutter loose. An iron weather vane in the shape of a riverboat sat on the peak of the roof at an angle. Everybody who looked at this house saw a haunted house. Eli stood at the gate and made himself see it the way Otis would have. He saw a roof. He saw bones. He saw 140 years of work that somebody had once done well enough that the building had outlasted them all. A movement in the second-floor window made him flinch. He looked up in time to see something pale slip back into the dark, low and quick. His heart went hard for a second until he understood the shape of it. A big dog watching him from inside. The front steps held his weight. Barely. The key fought the lock, then gave. The door swung inward on a long groan into a hall full of gray light and the smell of dust and cold ash and something underneath, faintly sweet, like old paper or a dried medicine he couldn't name. He stood on the threshold of the first thing he had ever owned and listened to the house be quiet around him. "Hello," he said, and felt foolish, and said it anyway. Nothing answered, but somewhere deeper in the house, soft on bare boards, he heard the dog moving. He went in. The hall opened into rooms gone to ruin in the patient way old houses go when nobody is looking. Plaster down in sheets, a chandelier furred with cobweb, a staircase curving up into shadow, with a banister he could tell at a touch was good solid walnut under the grime. He moved through slow cataloging damage and worth at the same time, the habit so deep he didn't notice he was doing it. The floors were wide plank pine and sound under his boots. The windows that weren't boarded were old wavy glass, the kind you couldn't buy anywhere anymore. Whoever had built this place had built it to last past them. The front parlor still had its original mantel, a tall walnut piece with carving along the cornice that had survived 11 years of neglect because nobody had bothered to vandalize it. The dining room across the hall had a long built-in china cabinet on one wall and an empty space where a table had once stood, the rectangle of the table marked on the floor in faded color, where the rest of the wood had darkened with the years. It was in the back hall that he stopped, because the back hall didn't make sense. There was a small reception desk built into the wall. Eli stood looking at it for a long time. It was the kind of desk you would find in the front room of a doctor's office, with a sliding glass window above it and a little counter for paperwork. The glass was gone, but the wood frame remained, and there was a slot cut into the counter where a brass plate had once sat. The plate was gone too, but the shape of it was visible where the wood beneath had been protected. Whatever the Doherty house had been, it had not been only a house. In the dining room across the hall, the molding around the door frame had been scarred top to bottom, not with the pencil marks of a growth chart, but with something different. Eli ran his thumb across the surface and felt small notches gouged into the wood at regular intervals. Hash marks, hundreds of them, in groups of 5, 4 vertical lines with the 5th slashed across. They climbed the door frame from waist height to the top. He didn't know what they counted, but somebody had been counting something for a long time. The kitchen, when he found it, was the size of a small restaurant's. A long enameled work table down the middle, a wood-burning stove in one corner, and a more modern gas range in the other. Glass-fronted cabinets along one wall, mostly empty, but in one of them, a row of brown glass apothecary bottles that had been left behind. Their labels yellowed past reading. Eli stood in the middle of it, with his 2 trash bags still in his hands, and felt the first real prickle of unease he'd felt since the gate. Not because the house was frightening. It wasn't. It felt, under the ruin, like a place that had been used for something, that wasn't just living. He was still standing there when the dog came down to find him. It appeared in the doorway, a big rangy hound with one cocked ear and ribs that showed through a coat the color of dirty straw, older than he'd thought, by the gray around its muzzle. It watched him with brown eyes that held no fear at all, the look you'd give a stranger who had wandered into your home. "I bought it," Eli told the dog, "fair and square, $20. The dog considered him a long moment. Then it turned and walked back into the hall and stopped and looked over its shoulder at him, waiting. Eli had grown up around enough stray animals to know what that meant. He set down his bags and followed. It led him up the curving staircase, sure-footed where the boards were soft, along the corridor on the 2nd floor, past 3 bedroom doors, and then it stopped at the end of the hall, in front of a stretch of wallpaper in a faded pattern of green vines. It sat down and stared at the wall and would not move. "There's nothing there," Eli said. The dog did not so much as flick an ear. Eli stopped looking at the dog and started looking at the wall. The hallway ran too short. He could see that now. From the outside, the house had run the full length back to the turret. From in here, the 2nd floor stopped a good 15 feet short at a wall papered in green vines with a hound dog sitting in front of it, like it had been waiting 11 years for somebody to come up and ask the right question. He pressed his palm flat against the paper. Behind it, faint and cool, came the draft of a space the rest of the house didn't know was there. The dog looked up at him, then back at the wall, patient as a clock spring. The light through the boarded windows had gone the color of ash. He had no lantern, no power, and a single Bic lighter in his jacket. Otis's first rule had always been that you do not take a thing apart in the dark. Whatever was sealed behind the green vine paper had waited longer than Eli had been alive. It could wait until he could see what he was doing. He went back down the stairs to make himself a place to sleep on the floor of a house he owned, and the dog stayed at the wall a while longer before it came down to find him. The first night he slept in his clothes on the parlor floor, zipped into the sleeping bag with his jacket bunched for a pillow and Otis's tool roll under his hand where he could reach it. The cold came up through the boards. The house talked the whole night. The small sounds old houses make, a tick in the walls, a long sigh in the chimney, a loose board settling somewhere over his head. Twice he woke sure he had heard footsteps, and both times it was the dog walking its rounds. Toward morning it came and lay against his spine, a warm weight, and he let it. "You stay, you eat," he told it, the only deal he'd ever known how to offer anybody. The dog didn't argue. By the 2nd day he had started calling it Briggs, for the engine company, and because it answered to it after 2 tries. He'd half expected to wake that first morning and talk himself out of it. A sane person would take the shelter bed in Coxsackie and wait for an apartment to come along. But he had woken in a house with his own name on the deed, the first roof that had ever been his to keep or lose, and handing the key back to the county was the one thing he knew he would not do. Whatever the house turned out to be, it was his now. He would either fix it or go down with it. Morning came up gray and honest through the gaps in the boards, and he walked the house with his hands. That was how Otis had taught him to look at a thing, with fingers, not eyes, because eyes will lie to a person, and good wood will not. The plaster was a loss in most rooms, but plaster was just plaster. The bones were good. The big timbers overhead were dry and true. The roof had one bad place over the back third of the house, where the sky showed through and a ragged coin of light and rain had been getting in there for years. But it was one place, and one place could be patched. He stood in the ruined back hall by the old reception desk and made a list in his head and started at the top, one bite at a time, because that was the only honest way to face down an impossible job. Stop the water first, then a door that locks, then light, then warmth. Everything after that was finished work he could do in his sleep. He had $48 and change. He went down the hill to spend some of it. Stillwell below had been built for more people than it had now. Wide brick streets and tall Italianate storefronts, half of them dark, the rest hanging on. The Hudson ran slow at the bottom of the town, gray and wide, with the wooded ridge of Columbia County rising on the far bank. He passed a coffee shop with steam on the windows, and his stomach said something about it, but he kept walking until he found what he needed. A low metal-roofed building on the edge of the old factory blocks. A yard full of salvaged doors and clawfoot tubs and stacks of reclaimed lumber gone silver in the weather. A hand-painted sign that read, "Quinn Salvage, Hardware, Odd Lots." A bell over the door announced him. Inside it smelled of old iron and cut pine, and a wood stove going somewhere in the back. A woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger she'd been writing in by hand. She was somewhere in her late 60s, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up into iron-gray hair and forearms that said she moved her own stock. "Help you find something?" she said. "I need a hasp and a padlock," Eli said. "A tarp big enough to patch a roof. Cement, the cheapest you've got, and lamp oil if you sell it." The woman set down her pen. "That's a specific list for somebody I've never seen. You doing a job?" "My own place. Fixing it up. Where at?" Eli had learned that the truth cost less than a lie in the long run, so he paid it. "Top of Ferry Hill. The Doherty house. I bought it at the county auction Thursday." The shop went quiet in a particular way. The woman looked at him over the tops of her glasses for a long moment. Then she came out from behind the counter. "You bought the Doherty house. $20. "Yes, ma'am." She let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something older. "Lord, somebody finally did." She put out a square, calloused hand. "Maeve Quinn, I own this place." Eli Hawthorne. Maeve looked him over. The duffel of a life he was clearly carrying. The boots that had walked a long way. She didn't ask any of the questions a worse person would have asked. "Come on, let's get your roof shut." She loaded the cart herself, and Eli noticed the prices she wrote on the receipt were not the prices on the tags. A kerosene lantern she called a loaner. A coil of good manila rope she called scrap. When Eli started to argue, she waved him off. "You're keeping the rain off the Doherty house," she said. "As far as I'm concerned, that makes you a customer for life, and you can owe me." They carried it out to the yard together, and Eli said, because he had to ask somebody, "What's the story on it? Everybody acts like I bought a grave." Maeve leaned against a stack of doors and folded her arms. "Depends who you ask. The county will tell you it's a tax write-off they couldn't give away. The kids will tell you it's haunted. There's a lady walks the upstairs at night with a lamp." She paused. "Ask me. I'll tell you the truth, which is that Honora Doherty lived in that house 52 years, and she never turned a soul away who needed something. And this town decided that was the strangest thing it had ever heard of." Her jaw tightened. "I called it the only sane thing on the block." Honora Dougherty, Eli said. Dr. Dougherty, that's who built it more or less, inherited it from her father in 1958, was the third generation of Doughertys in that house, practiced at Memorial Hospital till she retired in 2009. Died alone up there a year later. Maeve's eyes had gone somewhere else. Folks saw a light in the back upstairs window her last years and decided she was a ghost before she was even gone. Easier than asking after an old woman, I suppose. Easier than going up the hill. What did she do up there all those years? Maeve was quiet a moment. That, she said, is a longer story than your roof can wait for. You come back when the rain stopped, and I'll feed you and tell you some of it. She handed Eli the lantern. Go on. Light's burning. She looked at him a long moment. You got somewhere to sleep up there? It wasn't quite a question. It's got walls and a roof now. That's more than I had on Tuesday. Maeve looked at him a long moment more. Honora would have liked you, she said finally. She had a soft spot for the ones who turned up with nothing and didn't ask for a thing. Before Eli left, Maeve disappeared into the back and came out with a paper sack, warm, that turned out to hold half a roast beef sandwich on rye and a thermos of black coffee. She didn't make a thing of it. She just put it in the cart and said, "Eat while you work. You look like you've been skipping meals." Eli climbed the hill with more than he had come down with, and a strange tightness in his throat he didn't have a name for and didn't try to give one. He patched the roof that afternoon. It was cold, ugly work balanced on the steep slope with a tarp snapping in the wind and the roofing cement freezing on the trowel. But when he came down, the coin of sky over the back of the house was gone, and the building was, for the first time in 11 years, dry. He stood in the yard and looked up at his work and felt the specific clean satisfaction of a thing that had been broken and now was not. Briggs watched from the broken porch railing. The next morning he went at the front door. It had swollen in its frame across a decade of wet Hudson Valley winters, and it dragged so bad it wouldn't latch, which meant it wouldn't lock, which meant he might as well be sleeping in the yard. He took it off its hinges, laid it across 2 sawhorses he made from the porch rubble, and unrolled the canvas tool roll. He had Otis's tools, but he didn't have a plane. He had wrenches and gauges and a torque wrench and a magneto puller and a screwdriver his great-grandfather had worn the handle of. But he didn't have the one tool a man fixes a swollen door with. He thought about it for 10 minutes, and then he walked back down the hill, with the dimensions of the door written on a piece of scrap paper, and asked Maeve if she had a wood plane he could borrow. She handed him a Stanley No. 5 from a peg behind the counter, without a word, with the iron freshly honed. "You bring it back when you're done," she said, "and if you nick it, I'll know." He brought it back unnicked 3 hours later with a $5 bill folded in the palm she held out, and she pushed it back at him. "Keep your money," Maeve said. "Save it for the wiring you're going to need to redo before that house kills you." The front door latched true on the 3rd try, and the lock turned smooth. He stood inside the locked house and listened to the sound of the deadbolt sliding home, and it was as close as he had come to feeling anything in 7 years. He didn't notice the truck until the door of it shut. It was parked at his broken gate, a big, clean pickup that had never hauled anything heavier than a set of golf clubs. The man coming up his walk was the man who had turned around in his chair at the auction. He wore a good wool coat and good boots that had never seen a job site, and he was looking up at the house with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "That's a lot of work for one young man," he said, pleasant, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Whitney Holloway. You're the gentleman who surprised us all on Thursday." Lie. He didn't stop sanding the edge of the door he was now finishing. "Did I take something of yours?" Whitney smiled. The smile was practiced and not entirely unkind. "In a manner of speaking, my company's been putting this block back together for 4 years. Senior condos, a clinic, some retail, good for the town. This lot was the last piece, and I'll be honest with you, I had expected to pick it up quiet at the auction. He spread his hands. You beat me to it. No hard feelings. In fact, I came up here to make your week. How's that? I'll buy it from you today. $9,500 cash. And I'll throw in the cost of moving you anywhere in Greene or Columbia counties you want to go. He let the number sit, watching it land. You paid $20 for a condemned shell, Eli. I'm offering you $9,500 and a fresh start. That's not a negotiation. That's a gift. It was more money than Eli had ever seen in one place. For a second, the whole shape of an easier life opened in front of him. A deposit on an apartment, a real bed, a heater that came from a wall thermostat. He let himself look at it. Then he set the sandpaper down on the door and looked at Whitney Holloway instead. No, he said. Whitney blinked. People did not say no to him often. Eli could see that on him. I don't think you understand the position you're in, son. That house has open code violations going back years. There are people at the county who have wanted it condemned since before you were born. As the owner, that's your liability now, not the county's. I can make all of that disappear with a signature. His voice stayed warm, but underneath it the warmth had gone flat and level. Or I can let it run its course. And you can find out what it costs a person with $19 to fight a condemnation order. You came up here to be neighborly, Eli said, and now you're telling me you can have my house torn down. I'm telling you, Whitney said carefully, that I'm the best offer this house will ever get from anybody, ever. He took a card from his coat pocket and set it on the porch rail. Think about it overnight. Don't think about it too long. He walked back down to his clean truck and drove away, and Eli stood with the sandpaper in his hand and looked at the white rectangle of the card on the rail and did not pick it up. He found the notice taped to his gate the next morning. County of Greene, notice of unsafe structure, and a date for a hearing, 11 days out, when the building inspector would recommend whether the structure should be repaired or demolished. He read it twice. Then he folded it into his jacket beside the deed. Because a person who owns nothing learns to keep all his papers together. And he went back inside to the work, because the work was the only answer he had ever found to anything. But the wall would not leave him alone, and neither would the dog. Briggs had a vigil now. Every few hours he would climb to the second floor and sit in front of the green vine paper at the dead end of the corridor and stare. When Eli came up, Briggs would look at him and then back at the wall. The meaning of it was plain enough that Eli had stopped pretending not to understand. On the third afternoon, he gave in. He brought up the kerosene lantern and a putty knife and got down on his knees beside the dog and started to read the wall with his fingers. The wallpaper was newer than the wallpaper everywhere else in the house. That was the first wrong thing. Everywhere else the paper had faded and curled and gone to ruin. But this stretch was tight and whole, like it had been hung long after the rest, hung over something. He slid the putty knife under a seam and peeled. The paper came away in a long strip, and underneath was not plaster. Underneath were boards. Wide pine boards nailed flat across the wall in a rectangle taller than he was. And around the edges of the rectangle, he could see now the casing of a door frame that someone had covered on purpose. A door, boarded shut, papered over, hidden from a house that had forgotten it was there. He sat back on his heels, and his heart was going hard. "Okay," he said to the dog, and his voice came out unsteady. "Okay. You're right." He thought about Whitney's card on the rail and the notice in his jacket and the $9,500 he'd turned down. And for one cold moment, he wondered if he was about to find out exactly why the house had been sealed, and exactly why it had been worth $9,500 to a man to tear it down before anyone looked. Then he fit the claw of a pry bar he'd borrowed from Maeve into the first board and set his weight against it and pulled. The first board came loose with a shriek of old nails that echoed down the empty corridor. The second came easier. By the time he had pulled the fourth and could see the door hole behind them, the light outside had gone, and the only light left was the small gold circle of the lantern and the brown coins of the dog's eyes watching beside him. The door had no lock, just a porcelain knob gone yellow with age. He wrapped his hand around it, cold and smooth, and it turned, and the door swung inward on hinges that someone had oiled before they sealed it, swung inward without a sound, into a darkness that smelled of dust and dry paper, and underneath, very faint, of antiseptic, of the particular sharp, clean smell of a doctor's office that has sat empty for a long time but had once been kept clean every day. Eli lifted the lantern and held it through the doorway, and the light reached in and found the first thing, and he forgot how to breathe. The first thing the lantern found was an examination table, a standard medical examination table, the kind you see in any small clinic, with a vinyl-covered top, long since cracked along the seams, and a roll of paper at one end, gone yellow with the years. The paper had been pulled across the table the last time it had been used, the way a nurse pulls a fresh length of paper across after a patient gets up. Whoever had pulled it had not lived to pull the next one. Eli stepped through the doorway and lifted the lantern higher, and the room came up out of the dark around him. It was the missing end of the house, the part the hallway didn't reach, wide and low under the slope of the roof, with the round wall of the turret bulging out at the far end and a single tall window there, the window the town had seen a light in and called a ghost. The window had been painted over on the inside with black paint. Careful work, so no light would show. Somebody had not wanted to be seen up here. Somebody had sat up here anyway, year after year in the dark with a lamp. The walls were lined with glass-fronted cabinets, floor to ceiling on both sides, and the cabinets were full. Bottles and tins and rolled bandages and metal instruments laid out in trays. A blood pressure cuff hanging from a peg. A stethoscope coiled neat on a hook. A scale, the old kind with the weights you slid along a bar, standing in one corner. Across the back wall, a row of metal filing cabinets, 4 of them, side by side, dull green with brass label holders, each one with a small typed label that had yellowed but was still legible. 1958 to 1968, 1969 to 1978, 1979 to 1992, 1993 to 2010. A working medical clinic, sealed behind a dining room wall and left exactly as the last person to use it had left it. Eli set the lantern on a small desk under the painted window and stood for a long moment in the middle of a room that should not have existed. The dog had followed him in and was sitting beside him with the calm attention of an animal who already knew everything and had only been waiting for somebody to catch up. On the desk was a book. It was thick, bound in cracked black leather, the kind a doctor's office keeps for charts. It was the only thing in the room without dust on it, because the dust on it had been wiped by a hand more than once. The gloss of a thing that gets touched. Eli sat down in the wooden chair at the desk, the chair where Dr. Honora Doherty had sat alone in the dark for years, and he opened the book. At the top of the first page, in ink gone brown with age, it said, "Patients of this house." And under that, a single line. Every one of them was somebody's. We just took care of them when nobody else would. Then the entries began. They were short. The date. A name, sometimes only a first name. sometimes a first name and a question mark where a last name should be, an age, a line or two of treatment, a line or two of outcome. March 1959. Maria, 24. Husband won't let her see a doctor. Broken ribs, 2 of them. Set them and gave her $10 and the number of my cousin in Hudson who has a room. August 1961. Jonas, infant, 8 months. Brought by his mother who is 16 and cannot go home with him. Fever was 104. Penicillin and cold compresses through the night. Boy lived. Mother stayed 3 days and went on to Albany with him. November 1965. A man who would not give his name. Perhaps 40. Bullet wound, upper thigh. The bullet had passed clean. Cleaned and stitched. Sent him on with a bottle of antibiotics. He left a $20 bill on the table that I did not see him put there. Page after page. Year after year. The same neat handwriting recording the people no doctor was supposed to see. The undocumented, the uninsured, the women whose husbands hit them, the men who could not go to the hospital because going to the hospital meant police, the children whose families could not afford a copay, the addicts who could not go through formal channels, the runaways, the pregnant girls turned away from the Catholic hospital downtown, the men with HIV in the 80s when nobody knew what HIV was yet and people were dying alone because no one would treat them. Dr. Honora Dougherty had treated all of them for 52 years in a sealed room in the back of her house by lamplight for free while the town below crossed the street from her shadow. Eli read until the lantern guttered and he had to trim it, and then he read more. Some of the entries were 3 lines long. Some were a single sentence that held a whole life. A girl who came pregnant and afraid and left 2 days later with a plan and an address. A boy who came beaten and left with a job lined up at a friend of Honora's farm in Coxsackie. And one near the middle of the book, where a man's name had only this under it, came in unable to walk. Left 2 weeks later with a cane and a new last name. He is safe now. That was the entire entry. He is safe now. Eli read that one and had to set the book down and press the heels of his hands against his eyes until the burning behind them stopped. The house had not been haunted. The house had been the place that took in the people nobody else would treat. For 52 years, run by one woman who never told the town what she was doing because the town would have shut her down. Honora Dougherty had practiced at the county hospital by day and then come home and treated the people the county hospital was not permitted to treat. The people the law and the insurance system and the immigration system had decided didn't count. And when she got too old to keep doing it, she had not bragged about it or written a memoir. She had wiped down the exam table for the last time, sealed the door, papered it over, and sat in the dark in front of the painted window until she died. Then the house had waited 11 years for somebody to find the door. If you have made it this far into Eli's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Because Eli turned the last written page that night and found something tucked into the back of the ledger. A single sheet, folded once, and on it, in the same shaking hand of her last years, was the only instruction Honora Dougherty had left behind for whoever came after her. If you are reading this, the house has found you. It does that. I gave up asking why a long time ago. There is no money. If that's what you came up the hill for, I am sorry. What is here is older than money and harder to keep. Keep the door open. That is all. Keep the door open. Eli sat in the dark a long time with the page in his hands and the dog warm against his leg. And for the first time since he was 13 years old, since a barn that smelled of kerosene and grease, he felt like he had walked into a room and had the room get easier instead of harder. He had bought this house thinking he had gotten a roof for $20. He understood now that he had gotten something else, and that it had a weight to it, and that the weight had just become his. He did not sleep that night. He read every entry twice. The cabinets behind him held files going back to 1958, and he opened one of them, the second from the left, and pulled a folder at random and read it. And inside was the full record of a young woman who had come to the back door in 1973 with a complication from a procedure that had been done badly by somebody who should not have been doing procedures. Honora had treated her, kept her 3 days, sent her home with antibiotics and instructions and a name and a number in Kingston. The girl had recovered. The folder had a follow-up letter in it, dated 6 months later, from the girl herself, who had moved and gotten a job and was alive. There were over 4,000 folders in the 4 cabinets. Eli did the math on the back of an envelope while the dog watched. 52 years of practice, roughly 80 patients a year, one every 4 or 5 days for half a century. In the morning, he went down the hill to find Maeve, because he had to tell somebody or he would come apart, and Maeve took one look at his face across the salvage yard and put down what she was holding. "You found it," Maeve said. "Whatever it is, you found it." So Eli told her, in the back of the shop, over coffee in a chipped mug, and Maeve listened with her hands wrapped around her own cup and her eyes getting wet and angry at the same time. 52 years, Maeve said when Eli finished. "I knew a piece of it. Everybody my age knew a piece. The way you know a thing the whole town has agreed not to look at straight. You'd hear about somebody who'd gotten patched up. You wouldn't ask where. You'd see a car parked at the bottom of Ferry Hill late at night. You wouldn't ask whose. There was a man at my church for years in the 80s who'd had a leg saved by somebody, and he wouldn't say who. And we all stopped asking because asking him made him weep." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, rough. "We told ghost stories about that woman. We let our kids dare each other to look in her window. And the whole time, she was the one person in this town doing the actual work of keeping people alive who weren't supposed to be alive." "Why didn't she tell anyone?" Eli said. "Because in 1960, the state would have arrested her for practicing without a license at her own residence, even though she was a licensed physician. In 1980, they'd have done it for the same reason. In 2000, they'd have done it for the same reason. Plus, immigration would have come for the patients. She knew it. She knew it every single day for 52 years. Maeve shook her head. "Easier to be a ghost. A ghost can keep working. A do-gooder gets a visit from the state medical board." The word landed between them like a dropped tool. "The inspector," Eli said. "There's a hearing. 9 days now. Whitney Holloway says the house should come down." Maeve's face changed. "Whitney Holloway has been trying to get that lot for 4 years. He couldn't buy it from the estate because the estate was tied up in tax delinquency, and Honora's lawyer was a stubborn old man who kept finding ways to delay. And he couldn't get the county to condemn it fast enough because, frankly, nobody at the county wanted to be the one to send a wrecking crew up that hill." She leaned forward. "But you own it now. You're a teenager with no money and no lawyer. You just made it easy." "So what do I do?" Eli said. "I've got 9 days and $40. Maeve was quiet a moment. "You let me think on it. I've lived in this town 67 years, and I owe a few favors I never called in." She reached across the little table and gripped Eli's wrist hard and brief. "You're not the only one in Stillwell who's ashamed of how we treated that woman. There's more of us than you'd guess. We just need a reason to stop being cowards about it." "Why would you stick your neck out for me?" Eli said. "You met me 4 days ago." Maeve almost smiled. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for a dead woman I owe an apology to. And right now, you're the closest thing to her this town has left." She picked her pen back up. "Go home. Light a lamp in that turret window so the town can see it. I'll come find you when I've got something." Eli went home with that sitting in his chest and worked on the house with a new kind of fury, scraping and hauling and shoring up, because the work was the only thing that kept the fear from getting all the way in. He washed the black paint off the inside of the turret window so the light could come through it again. That was the first thing he did. It felt important, though he couldn't have said why. That evening, the light in the turret window brought someone up the hill. Eli heard the car laboring up the bad pavement and went out onto the porch with a flashlight, half expecting Whitney, half expecting the inspector. Instead, an old Buick stopped at the gate and a man got out slowly. He was in his 60s, black, wearing a brown corduroy jacket and a wool cap, leaning slightly on a cane he was clearly not yet used to. He stood at the broken gate and looked up at the lit window in the turret and put his free hand over his mouth. "Can I help you?" Eli called. "That light," the man said. His voice was rough. "That light has been off 11 years. I was driving past from my sister's down on Reed Street, and I saw it on, and I had to." He steadied himself on the gate. "I came to this house in 1979, he said. I'd been shot in a thing that wasn't my fault, and I couldn't go to a hospital because I was on the wrong side of some things at the time. And somebody told me about a doctor who didn't ask questions. She kept me 4 days. She charged me nothing. I have been alive 46 years because of her, and I never once came back up this hill to thank her." He looked at Eli, and his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. I never see that window lit again." Eli came down the steps and helped him up the broken walk and brought him inside and sat him in the one good chair. And the man looked around the ruined hall with tears running down the lines of his face and a smile under them. "It was warm in here," the man said. "Lord, it was warm. There was always a kettle going. There was always somebody at the table eating something. She made you sit down before she'd even look at your wound. She'd say, 'You'll hold still better with food in you.' She'd make you tell her your name. She never wrote a thing down till you'd told her your name." He looked at Eli. "How long were you here before?" "I wasn't," Eli said. "I bought it 3 weeks ago. $20 at the county auction." The man stared at him. Then he laughed, a wet, astonished laugh. "Of course you did. That's exactly how it goes. She used to say the house would find the next one." He caught Eli's hand in both of his, and his grip was stronger than a man with a cane should have been. "You're one of us. You just got here the long way around." "What happened to her?" Eli said. "At the end." The man's face faded. "Got old, same as everybody. Couldn't manage the stairs to the room at the back, couldn't stand at the exam table anymore. The last few years she couldn't take anybody at all, and I think that broke her worse than her own body did." He looked toward the dark stairs. "I came by once, just once, around 05, 06. I came up the walk, and I lost my nerve at the steps. I told myself she wouldn't remember me. I told myself I'd come back next month with flowers." His voice cracked. "I never did. I waited too long. By the time I'd worked up to it, she was gone." He turned the cane in his hands. "Don't let that window go dark again. Whatever you have to do, you keep it lit." They talked until late. Before the man left, Eli walked him to the room and opened the file cabinet, labeled 1979 to 1992, and pulled, with the man watching, a folder that had the man's name written across the tab in Honora's hand. Inside was the record of the surgery she had done on him over a kitchen table that was no longer in the house, and a follow-up note dated 3 weeks later, "Healing clean. Walked out today." The man put his hand flat on the folder and could not speak for a long time. "She kept it," he whispered. "All this time, she kept all of it." After he had gone, Eli went back up to the room and kept reading. because the man had given him a reason he hadn't had before. These were not entries anymore. They were people. People who were out there, scattered across the years in the country, who had once been saved in this house by a woman the town had called a ghost. He started a list of his own on the back of an envelope. Names and last known towns, though he couldn't have said yet what he meant to do with it. It just felt wrong to let them stay lost a second time. He was deep in a run of entries from the early 60s, 3 nights before the hearing, when he found the one that stopped him cold. It was longer than most. The date was February of 1963. A young woman named Elena, 22, had come to the back door in the middle of a snowstorm, undocumented, 6 months pregnant. The man who had brought her over the border having abandoned her in Albany 3 weeks earlier. She had been sleeping in the laundry room of a Catholic church whose janitor had quietly pointed her up the hill. Honora had taken her in, treated her for early-stage pneumonia, kept her until the spring. In April, she had delivered the baby in the back parlor with the help of a retired midwife Honora called in for the births. A boy. Both mother and child survived. Then a line that made Eli read it 3 times. Elena stayed through the summer. We found her work in the kitchen at the Mountain View Hotel through Mr. Holloway, who hired her without asking for paperwork because his wife had been my patient in '57. She has taken his last name as her own to make the boy's life easier. The boy will be raised as Daniel Holloway. Mr. Holloway is a good man and will treat him as his own. I have kept the record in case the day ever comes that the boy or his children need to know where they came from. Eli sat very still. He thought about a man in a good wool coat standing at the bottom of his porch steps, telling him his company had been putting this block back together for 4 years. He thought about the name on the notice taped to his gate. He thought about Whitney Holloway, who had introduced himself by his full name in the way of a man whose name had always opened doors for him. He turned the page. There was a note added later in a hand grown older and shakier than the rest. Daniel grew up, married Margaret Whitcomb. They had 2 children, the second of whom is named Whitney. Whitney is a builder in Albany now. He does not know any of this. His grandfather, Mr. Holloway, carried the secret with him to the grave in 1991, and his mother, Elena, carried it to hers in 2003 and never spoke of the winter she was 22. I have not interfered. It is not mine to tell, but it is written here in case it ever needs to be given back. The hearing was 3 days away. The man who wanted to send a wrecking crew up this hill had been born in the back parlor of the house he was trying to tear down. The only proof in the world was sitting in Eli's 2 hands. For 2 days, Eli carried the page everywhere, folded in his jacket beside the deed and the condemnation notice, and he thought about what it was. It was a weapon. He understood that much. A man who wanted his house torn down had been born in its back parlor, and he didn't know. And Eli was the only person alive who could prove it. He could walk into Whitney's office and lay the page on his desk and watch him understand that Eli could tell the whole town where Whitney Holloway came from, that his grandmother had spent a winter as a frightened, undocumented girl in the house he had called an eyesore. He could make Whitney stop. People had made Eli do things his whole life by holding the one card he couldn't beat. The state had done it for 7 years. Caseworkers had done it. Group home directors had done it. A juvenile court judge in Albany had done it on the strength of a single statement from a man who'd lied. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he decided he would rather lose the house than win it like that. He told Maeve about the room and the cabinets and the ledger, all of it but the part about Elena, because that part wasn't his to spend. Maeve listened, and Maeve started making phone calls. And over those 2 days, something began to happen in the town that nobody had planned. The man with the cane told his sister. The sister told 2 more. It turned out the town of Stillwell was full of people who had a thread back to the Doherty house if you pulled on it. A woman whose father had been treated for tuberculosis in the back room in 1962. A retired school teacher whose pregnant sister had been kept 3 weeks in 1975. The owner of a hardware store on Front Street whose grandfather had walked out of the back room alive in 1968 with a knife wound stitched clean. A retired nurse who had quietly assisted Honora on weekends for 15 years and who had not spoken about it to a soul, not even her own husband, since the late 90s. They had all carried their piece of it alone, half ashamed, and now somebody had opened the door and lit the window, and one by one they came to find out it was real. They came up the hill in 1s and 2s those 2 evenings. People Eli had never met stopping at the broken gate, the same as he had 3 weeks before. He brought them in. He lit a kerosene lamp in the turret room and let them open the file cabinets and find their own names or the names of family members on folders that had been kept for half a century. He watched grown men come apart over a follow-up letter their dead mother had once written. The retired nurse held a folder a long time. "I assisted her on this one," she said. "I was 26. I'd never seen a procedure like that done outside a hospital. I came in shaking the next morning, and she made me coffee and told me I'd done fine. I didn't believe her. I went home and cried in my car." She looked at Eli. "She saved that man's life, and she saved me too because I almost quit nursing after that. She told me a thing I've thought about every day since. She said you don't get to choose what kind of medicine you can do legally. You only get to choose what kind of medicine you do." A man in his 50s found a folder with his mother's name on it. "She told me before she died that there was a doctor in Stillwell once who saved her when she was 16, and that I owed my life to that doctor. I asked her the name. She wouldn't say. She said it wasn't fair to the doctor to say it." He looked up. "Now she's gone, and I'm standing in the doctor's house, and the doctor's gone too, and I don't have anyone left to thank." He put his hand on the file cabinet, palm flat. "Thank you," he said to it. By the second night, there were 3 casseroles on the kitchen counter that Eli had not bought, and a box of work gloves by the door, and a folded check tucked under the lamp with no name on it. The house was waking up, and the town was waking up around it. The night before the hearing, Eli could not make his hands hold still. He had faced down plenty of things alone. Caseworkers in group homes and the cold, but he had never once stood up in a room full of adults and asked them for anything, because asking and getting told no was the one wound he had taught himself to stop opening. Maeve found him on the porch at dusk and sat down heavy on the step. "You don't have to be eloquent," she said. "You just have to tell them the truth and let them look at you while you do it. That's harder. But it's the only thing that ever works. And if they vote to tear it down anyway, they do it in front of every person who stood up for it, and this town has to live with their own faces afterward. Either way, you make them look." The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in a low county room with bad carpet and a long table at the front. Eli got there early, in his cleanest clothes, which were not clean enough, and sat in the front row with the ledger in a canvas tote on his lap. Whitney Holloway came in with the building inspector and a man in a suit Eli took for a lawyer, and they sat at the front like the outcome was already arranged, which it likely was. Whitney gave Eli a small nod, almost kind. He thought he was about to do Eli a favor. Eli was too young to understand. The inspector read the violations first, a long, flat list: failing porch, compromised roof, no certificate of occupancy, electrical and plumbing condemned years back. He recommended the structure be declared unsafe and scheduled for demolition. The lot to be cleared at the owner's expense, or, if the owner could not pay, at the county's. Then Whitney stood, and he was good at this, easy and warm and reasonable. "I want to be clear that nobody is the villain here," he said. "That house is dangerous. A 19-year-old bought it sight unseen for $20, and he cannot possibly bring it up to code. I'm not here to take anything from him. My company is prepared to cover the demolition, settle the back taxes, and pay this young man a fair price on top, so that he walks away with money in his pocket instead of a debt he will never climb out of." He spread his hands to the room. "That's not cruelty. That's mercy. Sometimes the kind thing is to let a thing go." Heads nodded. It sounded like mercy. It sounded like the only sensible end to a foolish story. The chairman of the board looked down at Eli. "Mr. Hawthorne, you are the owner of record. Do you have anything to say before we vote?" His legs did not want to hold him, but they did. "I do." His voice came out smaller than he wanted, so he made it bigger. "Mr. Holloway says I can't bring it up to code. He's right that I can't do it alone. And he's right that I don't have money. But he doesn't know what the house is. None of you do. I didn't either until last week." He lifted the ledger out of the tote and set it on the rail in front of him. "This was sealed in a room behind a wall in that house. It's a record. 52 years of it." He opened it and read. Just a few. "Maria, 1959. Broken ribs. Husband won't let her see a doctor. Set them and gave her $10 and the number of my cousin in Hudson. Jonas, 1961. Infant, fever 104. Lived. A man who would not give his name. 1965. Bullet wound, upper thigh. Sent him on with antibiotics." He read them flat and plain. No performance, and the bad carpet room got very quiet. "Dr. Honora Dougherty practiced medicine in this town for 52 years, Eli said. "By day at the hospital, by night in her house. She treated the people who couldn't go to the hospital, the undocumented, the uninsured, the kids whose parents couldn't pay, the women whose husbands hit them, the men with HIV in the 80s when nobody else would touch them. She did it for free. She did it for half a century. She never asked for credit, and she never got any. You called her a ghost, so you wouldn't have to call her anything else." He closed the book. "You can vote to tear that down, but you should know what you're tearing down before you do." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, in the back of the room, the man with the cane stood up. "I lived through a gunshot in 1979 because of her," he said. His voice rang clear. "I'd be in a Stillwell cemetery if she hadn't taken me in. I've been a deacon at First Baptist 40 years, and I never told my own pastor where I went that week." He looked around the room. "I'm not a ghost story. I'm right here." Then the retired nurse stood. "I assisted her for 15 years, and I never told a soul. Not even my husband. I am tired of being ashamed of the best work I ever did." Then the man whose mother had been treated in 1962. Then the hardware store owner. Then a woman by the window whose pregnant sister had been kept 3 weeks in 1975. One after another, all over the room, people stood and said a year out loud, and the years ran back more than half a century. And the bad carpet county room filled up with the sound of a town saying plainly what it had only ever whispered. Whitney Holloway turned in his chair and watched the place he thought he owned the whole story of get to its feet around him. Eli turned to him. He had gone still. The smooth was gone out of his face. "You can buy the lot, Mr. Holloway," Eli said quietly. "You've got the money and I don't. But you can't buy what made it matter. That part was never for sale, and it never will be." The chairman called a recess. In the hallway, while the room buzzed behind them, Eli found Whitney standing alone by a window, and he made the choice he had been carrying for 2 days. He took the folded page out of his jacket. "This was in the room too," he said, "with the cabinets. I almost used it to make you stop. I want you to know I thought about it." He held it out. "But it isn't mine. It's yours. I think you should have it, whether you tear the house down or not." Whitney took it with the wary hands of a man who'd been handed bad paper before. He unfolded it. Eli watched him read, watched his eyes go down the entry once fast and then again slow, and then stop. "Where did you get this?" Whitney said. His voice had changed. "She wrote it. Dr. Doherty. She kept track of everyone and where they went and what happened to them. Your grandmother stayed the winter of 1963. She had a baby in the back parlor of that house in April. She named him Daniel." Eli said it as gently as he had ever said anything. "Your grandmother had your father in that house, Mr. Holloway. She was 22 and undocumented and alone, and a doctor at the top of a hill took her in and kept her safe for 6 months. Then, a man named Mr. Holloway, who you're named after, gave her a job and a last name so the boy would have an easier life. Dr. Dougherty wrote it down in case the day ever came that somebody needed to give it back to you. Whitney Holloway, who built half the east side, who had walked up the hill to do a stranger a favor the stranger was too young to understand, stood in a county and read a dead woman's handwriting about his own grandmother, and his face came apart. "My grandmother had a year nobody talked about," he said. The words came slow. "My whole life. There was a year before she met my grandfather. If you asked her, she'd leave the room. I thought—" He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. "I thought it was something shameful. I built things to make up for whatever it was. I never knew." He looked at the page like it might dissolve. She was a kid. She was alone, in a country that didn't want her. And she was a kid, and somebody took her in, said. "In the house you came here to knock down." Whitney looked down at the page again, then up at Eli. There was something almost frightening in it. A big, successful man undone by 12 lines of a stranger's handwriting. "Why are you giving me this?" he said. "I was trying to take your house out from under you an hour ago. You could have buried me with this." "Because it's true whether I stay angry at you or not," Eli said. "And because somebody once taught me that a motor isn't dead because it stopped. It's dead when nobody's willing to listen to what's wrong." He nodded at the page in Whitney's hands. "That's yours. It always was. I just held on to it for you a while." For a long moment, Whitney couldn't speak. When he did, his voice was wrecked. "My grandmother had a year she never named her whole life," he said. "You just handed it back to her." He folded the page along its old crease, careful, like the keepsake it was. And to me, when the recess ended, Whitney Holloway stood up before the vote and withdrew his company's interest in the property. He asked the county instead to grant the owner a repair timeline. He said his crews and his money were available to whoever was restoring the house, on whatever terms the owner set, and that he would cover the back taxes himself, not to own anything, only to keep it standing. The inspector, looking at a room full of witnesses and a developer who had just changed his whole position, recommended a year to bring the structure to code instead of the wrecking ball. It passed. Nobody voted against a house the whole room had just stood up for. The back taxes came to a little over $5,000, 11 years of a house nobody had wanted. Whitney paid it the next morning in person, at the same county window, where Eli had counted out his $20 in ones and a 5. He didn't ask for his name on a single piece of paper. As for Honora's own money, the small steamer trunk under her desk in the turret room held exactly what she had promised in her note, which was almost nothing. a roll of silver dollars worn smooth from handling, $42 in an envelope marked for the next one, a house, and the names of everyone it had ever saved. It had never been about money. It had only ever been about the door. Outside on the courthouse steps, Maeve found Eli and gripped him by both shoulders and didn't say anything for a second because she couldn't. The retired nurse was crying and laughing at the same time. Strangers who had stood up inside came to shake Eli's hand and tell him a year, a name, a piece of the house they had carried along for decades and could finally set down. That night Whitney came up the hill. He came alone, in old clothes, not the wool coat, and he stood at the broken gate a long time before he came up the walk. Eli let him in. He didn't have power yet, but he had the wood stove he and Maeve had wrestled in that afternoon, and it threw real heat into the front parlor for the first time in 11 years, and he had candles. Up in the turret, the window glowed gold over Stillwell for anyone who cared to look. "Can I see it?" Whitney said. "The room." Eli took him up. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the walls of cabinets, the examination table, the desk under the window where the black paint was washed away now and the night showed through. Eli showed him the folder with his grandmother's name on it. There wasn't much in it. A short medical history written in Honora's hand. A photograph clipped to the inside of the folder of a young woman holding a newborn in a hospital blanket, taken with a camera somebody had brought up the hill. The woman smiles shy and exhausted and real. A note from the midwife, dated April 1963. Boy, 6 pounds 4 ounces, mother strong, both well. Whitney sat down on the floor among 52 years of saved patients with the folder in his lap. A man in his 50s in the dark, and he took the things out one at a time and held them. Eli left him there. Some rooms a person needs to be alone in. Downstairs, he stood at the front window and looked out over the town spread below the hill, the same town that had crossed the street from this house for half a century. A few of its windows were lit. He wondered how many of them had a thread running back up this hill that nobody had ever pulled. How many people down there owed a year of their life, or a leg, or a child, to a woman they had been taught to be afraid of. He went down to the warm front room and sat by the stove, with Briggs heavy against his hip, and through the floorboards overhead, he could hear the low, broken sound of a grown man crying in a house his grandmother had been safe in, and he did not feel like he had won anything. Whitney came down after a long while, holding the folder against his chest like it might spill. His eyes were red, and he didn't bother to hide it. He sat down across the stove from Eli, and for a man who had walked up the hill that first day with a number in his mouth, he had a hard time finding any words at all. "I want to help," he said finally. "Not buy it, not put my name on it. Help." He looked around the ruined front parlor at the wood stove and the candles and the dog. "Tell me what it's supposed to be, not what it was, what you want it to be." Eli had been turning that over for a week without saying it out loud, and now it came easy. "A clinic," he said. "What she made it. A place that treats the people who can't go anywhere else. The uninsured, the undocumented, the ones who fall through the cracks. We do it legal this time. We make it a real non-profit. We get doctors and nurses to volunteer. We treat anybody who walks up the hill. We don't ask questions. We don't have to ask." He looked at Whitney. That's what she would have wanted. To not have to hide anymore. To keep the door open. Whitney nodded slowly, like Eli had handed him a blueprint he could finally read. "Then, that's what we'll build." But it was Maeve who made it real. She came up the hill 2 days later with a folder under her arm and set it on the kitchen table. "You can't run a clinic full of patients out of your back pocket at 19, she said. "Not legal, not safe, not for long. So here's what we do. We make it a real thing. A charity with a board and grown people who answer for it. She tapped the folder. You run it, but you do not carry it alone, because that's the one mistake she made. Maeve's voice caught on the last of it. Honora carried this house by herself for 52 years, she said, and this town let her, and it near broke her at the end. And we are not doing that to you. Do you hear me? We are not doing that to you. So they made it real. The retired nurse who had assisted Honora for 15 years took the medical operations end. Whitney put up the money to start, and his name on none of it. Maeve put up herself. A doctor from Memorial Hospital, who had been one of Honora's young residents in the 90s, heard about the project and came to the second meeting and volunteered her Tuesday and Thursday evenings. A retired pharmacist offered to manage the donated medications. A young lawyer in Albany, who had been one of Honora's patients as a teenager, the daughter of an undocumented woman who had come to the back door in 1996, handled the 501c3 paperwork for free. Eli, who owned the house and the deed and the whole strange inheritance of it, signed the line as the one who would keep the door open. By the next spring, you would not have known it for the same house. It took the whole winter and most of the town. Whitney's crews put a new roof on it and made the wiring and the plumbing honest again. But they worked alongside people who weren't on anybody's payroll, and that was the part that mattered. The retired nurse turned out to know more about exam room layout than anybody on the design team and refused to let them simplify it. The man with the cane spent his weekends at the salvage yard, helping Maeve sort through donations. A retired electrician spent his Saturdays running new circuits and refused gas money. Maeve emptied half her yard up the hill, period doors and a clawfoot tub and a farmhouse sink, all of it at the price of nothing. Eli did the finish work himself. Every door and window and stair tread that needed a man with patient hands. The Stanley No. 5 plane Maeve had loaned him on the second day she gave to him on the 5th month. No ceremony. Just walked it up the hill and set it on the kitchen table and walked back to her truck. Otis's tool roll deserved a friend, she said when he tried to thank her. That's all. The house came back under his fingers, the way the little Briggs and Stratton had come back when he was 13, bolt by bolt, coat by coat. The thing about ruin he had learned was that it was almost never as deep as it looked. Underneath it, the bones were usually still good. They just needed somebody willing to listen to what was wrong. It wasn't all clean and easy. There was a stretch in February when the starting money ran thin and a cold snap froze the new pipes before they were wrapped, and Eli stood in 2 inches of water in the cellar at 6 in the morning and came as close as he ever came to believing the town had been right about the house all along. He sat down on the cellar steps in the dark and let himself, for about a minute, feel 19 and alone and in over his head. Then he heard the front door open and boots on the stairs and Maeve calling his name and the retired electrician's voice behind it. Somebody had noticed his lights and called somebody else. By noon, there were 7 people in his cellar with a shop heater and a torch, and the pipes were saved, and somebody had brought soup. This is the part the ghost stories never told, Maeve said, pushing a bowl into his hands. Takes a whole town to haunt a house. Takes a whole town to unhaunt one too. That was the difference, Eli thought, between Honora's 52 years and his own first year. Honora had done it in secret, alone, in the dark, with the window painted black so no one would see her. Eli got to do it with the lights on, and with people who came when the pipes froze. The work was the same work. He didn't have to carry it by himself, and that changed everything about how heavy it weighed. The turret window got new glass, clear glass, and every night Eli left a lamp burning in it. The town below had spent half a century crossing the street from a dark window they had called a ghost. Now there was a warm one at the top of the hill, and they got used to looking up at it. Some of them started to find reasons to come up. They came on a Sunday in May, the ones who could. Maeve and the retired nurse had spent 2 months tracking them down, working from the names in the ledger and the list Eli had started on the back of an envelope. Calling old numbers, writing letters, following threads across 40 years in a dozen states. Not all of them were living. Some couldn't travel, but more than 50 of them came back to the house on Ferry Hill that Sunday. Gray-haired, most of them, some with their own grown children in tow, and they walked through the rooms where they had been treated and put their hands on the doorframe in the dining room. The one scarred top to bottom with hash marks, and Maeve, who had been doing some asking around, explained what they were. Honora had made a notch in that frame every time somebody walked out of the house alive. Every 5 people, she drew a slash through the 4. Hundreds of marks, thousands. The frame had been counted to once, and Maeve had read the number to Eli over the phone the night before. 4,216. 4,216 people walked out of the house alive who shouldn't have, wouldn't have, couldn't have. In the doorway at one point in the afternoon and looked at the long kitchen table full of people who had every one of them once been a patient nobody else would treat. He thought Honora should have lived to see it. Then he thought that maybe, in the only way that counted, she finally had. Nobody renamed the house. Somebody suggested a plaque, and Eli said no. It was the Doherty house. It had always been the Doherty house. The woman it was named for had never wanted a word of credit while she was alive, so she wasn't going to get a brass sign now that she was gone. The only thing that changed was the window. It stayed lit. The clinic opened in September, 2 days a week to start. The retired nurse worked the front. The volunteer doctor came up the hill on Tuesday evenings after her hospital shift and saw the patients Eli and Maeve had screened through the week. They saw 12 people the first night. 9 of them paid nothing. 3 of them left a few dollars on the counter on the way out, because that was what they had. The first patient at the door, the very first one, was a woman in her late 20s Eli had not seen before. She stood at the broken gate at dusk on opening night with one hand resting on her belly and the other on the iron of the gate, looking up at the lit window in the turret like she could not quite believe in it. She was small and tired-looking, in a thin denim jacket that was not enough for an upstate September evening. She did not look like a person who had decided to come. She looked like a person whose feet had brought her against her will. Eli came down the walk. "It's open," he said. She nodded once. She didn't move. "You can come in. We don't need anything from you. We don't ask anything." She looked at him. Up close, he could see she was further along than the jacket had let on. He could see the wet at the corners of her eyes that she was working to hold in. "I have no insurance," she said. Her English was good, but careful. "I have been told 3 places. They will not see me without insurance. We don't take insurance. We don't take any insurance at all. Come inside. The doctor is waiting." She came through the broken gate. He took her into the front parlor and sat her in the one good chair, the same chair he had sat the man with the cane in, the chair Honora had used for her own patients before any of them set foot in the back. The retired nurse took her hand and walked her through the intake form slowly. The doctor met her in the back room. Eli stood out in the hall with Briggs and waited, because waiting outside a door was something he could do. 40 minutes later, the door opened, and the woman came out with a paper bag of prenatal vitamins and an appointment card for 2 weeks out, and the slightly stunned face of a person who had been told nothing she had not expected to be told, except that it had been told kindly and that nobody had threatened to call anyone. She stopped at the front door and turned back and looked at Eli for a long moment. "How much?" she said. "Nothing." "How it works? That's how it has always worked." Her face folded then. She covered her mouth with her hand. She did not cry, but she came close to it, in the careful way a person who has been a long time alone allows herself to come close to it. "My grandmother told me about a house in this town," she said, "when I was a girl in Honduras. She said her sister came to America in the 70s, and she got very sick, and there was a doctor in a town on a river who saved her. My grandmother said for years, if you are ever in trouble in that country, you find that town, and you ask for the doctor in the house on the hill." She wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand. "I have been in this country 8 years. I never asked. I thought my grandmother was telling a story." She looked at him. She wasn't telling a story. "No," Eli said. "She wasn't. The doctor. The doctor died a long time ago, but the house is still here, and the door is still open. That's the part that matters." She nodded. Briggs leaned against her leg. She put her hand down on his head without looking, and held it there for a moment. Then she went out through the broken gate and down the hill, with the bag of vitamins and the appointment card and a piece of news she would carry home to whoever was waiting for her. And Eli stood on the porch and watched her go. The next morning he found Maeve on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee from the diner downtown. She handed him one without a word. He sat down beside her. The sun was just up over the Hudson, and the river ran flat and gray under it, and the town below them was waking. A truck went down Main Street. Somewhere a dog that wasn't Briggs barked once and stopped. "How many last night?" Maeve asked. 12. Most of them came back today to sit on the porch and visit. I don't think they have anywhere else where somebody knows their name." Maeve nodded. She drank her coffee. "That part doesn't show up in a clinic budget," she said. "But it's most of what she did, Honora. She fixed people, sure, but what she really did was give them a place where somebody knew their name." She looked at him sideways. "You did good last night." "It was the nurse. It was you." She set her coffee down on the step. "My mother had a stroke in 2003, she said. Bad one. She lived 3 more years after. She couldn't talk much. The last week of her life, when she was in and out of knowing things, she said a name twice. Honora. Both times. I never knew till you found that room what Honora had been to my mother. I never asked. I never thought to ask." Maeve's eyes were on the river. "There is one folder in those cabinets I have not been able to bring myself to open. I will. One day, not today." Eli didn't say anything. "You don't have to carry the whole thing yourself," Maeve said. "That's the whole point of what we built. You hear me?" "I hear you." "Good." She finished her coffee and stood and brushed the dust off the back of her jeans. "I'll see you Tuesday." Tuesday. She walked down the hill toward her truck. Briggs followed her halfway down the walk and then turned around and came back up and sat at Eli's feet and watched her go. That night, Eli walked the house before bed, the way he always did now, checking the doors, banking the stove, Briggs trailing him down the dark hall. He climbed to the turret room last and stood at the window where Honora had sat alone in the dark for so many years, with the paint scraped black so no one would see. The paint was gone. The glass was clear. Below him, Stillwell lay scattered in its own small lights, and up here, one more light burned where the whole place could see it. He had been 19 years old when he had walked out of a county office with 2 trash bags and $68 and a tool roll a dead man had given him. He had bought a haunted house for $20 on a Thursday morning because he had nowhere else to be. He had opened a wall and found a doctor's life work sealed inside it, and he had found out that the haunting had never been a ghost at all, only the shape of a woman the town had been too small to look at honestly while she was alive. He had $9,000 in a clinic operating account that other people had put there. He had a partner in Maeve and a builder in Whitney, and a doctor on Tuesday evenings, and a nurse on every other day of the week, and a dog at his feet, and a town that had stopped crossing the street from his front gate. He had a roof. He had a door. He had a light in a window that the whole town could see. He had never been a person who had any of those things before. He trimmed the lamp and left it burning, the way he did every night for a long time to come. Nobody had ever left Eli Hawthorne anything but a folder and a list of shelters, and he spent the rest of his life making sure that was never the end of anybody's story.